Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to Fundamentals of Programming course. In today's session we will be talking about file handling, more specifically how we can read data from the files. Last time we saw how we can write something onto the files, and today we will be diving deep into the concept of how we can read something from the files. But before that, one important concept needs understanding, and that is basically of string input. So let's look at that concept. Till now we have seen that how we can take input in a variable is that we need to first define a variable, then we, for example, output some string so that it tells user what action to take. For example, the string can be enter any number, then we take input in that variable that we had already defined. The purpose of already defining a variable was that the data, whatever data user inputs, can be stored somewhere at the back end. So we take input in that variable through cin, and if we want to display the value stored in that variable, we just use cout x. That was basically for when the data was of type integer. Now what happens when we want to take a string input? In case of string input, first we have to include a header library, string.h or string, that basically allows us to use strings in our programs. Here, for example, we have defined a string variable, just like we used to define any variable in which we wanted to store our data of whatever type the data was coming from the user. Here we define a string variable named receiver. So a variable named receiver is defined here. Then we show onto the console some intuitive line that tells user what action to take. Then we write enter a string, and then after that, how do we take string input? We make use of getLine function. So basically getLine function does is it uses the cin object in order to take input in the string variable. For example, just like we used to write cin x in case when we were taking input in the integer variable, when we are taking input in the string variable, one of the ways is the following: make use of getLine function, and then in the brackets write cin and the variable name in which we have to take input. For example, we had to take input in the string variable receiver that we had defined here, so we write that variable here, and along with that we write cin, which is basically an object that is used for taking input from the console. So by using this line of code, getLine cin receiver, what happens is that the input from the console is received in the string variable. The string input from the console is received in the string variable named receiver here. So that is how we can take a string input from user. Now if we have to display that value received from the user back onto the screen, we make use of cout. Just like if we wanted to display the value that was immediately before taken input from user back onto the screen. Similarly, whatever we have received here in the variable receiver is displayed back onto the screen immediately after that, just for testing purposes. So that is the mechanism through which we take string input from user. But what happens if we run this code line by line is that first this enter a string line gets written onto the console. And then basically we jump onto the next line. So we come into the next line, just like when we were taking input in an integer variable. For example, we write enter number, and then when the cin comes, what happens is that the console waits for some time so that the user can input some data. Similarly, when getLine cin receiver comes, the console waits. It waits for the user to enter some string, and for example, user enters a string hello space world. and that's all he wants to write onto the console window when it is prompted with enter a string. So it enters hello world, and then it just presses enter. For example, when we are taking a variable taking an input in a variable x, user enters, for example, 44, and then when he is done with inputting his data, he presses enter. In the same way, when he is done writing hello space world, user presses enter. This is not basically written onto the console. This is just for purposes that what will user be doing here. So user presses enter here, so as to tell that my input is over now. So hello space world and enter, and it means that the input has been received. For example, whenever we give some input in a variable and then press enter, that value is received in the x, and this line has been executed, uh, and and the code and the program goes on to the next line, and that is printing that value that has come in onto the screen back. So here when the user presses enter here, it means that he is done with it means that he is done with giving some input, and this line of code has already been executed. When user presses enter here, the program goes on to the next line and prints whatever was present in the receiver. So receiver used to so what gets printed onto the screen here is just like that, hello space world. That's it. That gets printed onto the screen, hello space world. Now, have you ever thought why this line of code gets printed, why nothing else gets printed? It is because the getLine function has basically 3 arguments. However, here we have given 2. It technically has 3 arguments. The first one is the object through which we will be receiving the input. The second is where we will be storing our input. Here we were receiving the input from console, so the object cin can be used, and we were storing that input. Whatever user inputs is stored in the string variable receiver here, that was defined in this case. The second argument is that string variable in which we have to take input, and there is a third argument that is named as delimiter, and that can be any character, any single character. For example, new line character \n is basically a single character, just like comma is a single character, just like space is a single character. Similarly, \n is basically a single character that is known as new line character. So the third argument is basically any character, and that character is known as a delimiter. Now, what is delimiter and why we do not have used it here in our delimiter? Delimiter is basically a character that separates one unit of data from another unit of data. For example, if I have certain numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For example, I have these numbers, and now these numbers are separated from each other through a character that is comma. This is basically a comma. These all are commas. So delimiter is a character that separates one unit of data from the other unit of data. One unit of data is this number, the other unit of data is this number. So this delimiter, that is comma character in this case, separates one unit of data from another unit of data. Similarly, 2 and 3 are separated from a delimiter, another comma. Similarly, 3 and 4 are separated from each other by a delimiter named comma. So the delimiter is a character that separates one unit of data from another unit of data. It also marks the beginning of one unit of data and the end of other unit of data. Just like this comma indicates that the first unit of data is ended here, that data was basically 1. It can be 10, 11, 123, 124, 1096, any number. For example, 1096, for example, is a number. So this comma has separated this unit of data from this unit of data. It indicates the end of one unit of data and marks the beginning of another unit of data. So this is basically a delimiter. Delimiter can also be a space. For example, if I am writing 1 space 2 space 3 space 4 space 5. So in this case, the delimiters are spaces here in between the numbers. 1 and 2 have a delimiter between them, that is basically a character named space. So these are basically the delimiters. First input to the getLine function was the first argument to the getLine function was cin object, the object that can be used for receiving input from the console. Second is the string object, string variable that can basically receive something from the console and store in itself. And the third argument is the delimiter. By default, if we do not write any delimiter, this statement and this statement are equal. It means that by default the third argument that was here was \n. That is why we have not written \n here and got away with it. It is just like writing C in receiver in the single inverted commas \n, that is basically a delimiter by default. So these two lines are equal here. If we do not write the third argument, the compiler by default knows that it is basically \n. So we do not need to write any delimiter here if the delimiter is by default and it is \n. That is basically how we can take input from the string. We just saw how if we do not give a third argument to the getLine function, what happens is that it takes the default third argument as a new line character, that is basically \n. Let's try it with some different delimiter. For example, if the third argument that is delimiter is comma, how the input is received in this case. For example, first there will be enter a string line to prompt the user, then it will jump onto the next line. Enter a string, it jumps onto the next line. Then here it waits for the user to input something because of getLine and cin and receiver and element. So a user enters, for example, here hello, comma, word, and then user presses enter. When the user presses enter, it means that user is saying that I have done giving the input. However, here the delimiter was a comma, and we know that delimiter marks the beginning or the end of one unit of data. So it basically getLine function basically stops reading anything from the console, i.e. any input given after this comma is not read by the getLine function, because here our delimiter was a comma, and as soon as the comma is arrived, that's all where the getLine function will be reading data from the input. So in this case, what will be basically stored in the string receiver, the data was input from the console into the variable receiver. However, the getLine function stopped reading as soon as it encountered a comma, because comma was a delimiter in this case that marked the end of the input. So when user presses enter, program goes on to the next line and prints what was stored in the receiver, and what was stored in the receiver would only be a hello and nothing else. The comma does not get printed, just like \n did not get printed in the last example. Comma does not get printed onto the screen. Only anything that was entered before this comma will be read from the console. So that is basically the difference between a backslash using a \n character versus the comma as a delimiter. When we write comma as a delimiter, the getLine function only reads up to the point where the comma is achieved. For example, here the comma was achieved at hello, and anything that came before that was read, nothing after that was read, and that was basically displayed in the next line onto the screen. We just saw how we can take string input from the console. Now we will be focusing on how we can read something from the files. Just to give a little bit of overview that one thing we have is a code, the other thing is a console, and the third thing is a file. When we have to write something onto the console, we make use of cout, and cout is the object of the class ostream, output stream. However, cout is an object that cannot be used for writing onto the files. Similarly, when we have to bring something from the console into our code, we make use of cin. Cin is an object of istream class, and istream stands for input stream, and istream cannot be used for example, istream's objects should not be used for taking input from the file. Similarly, we have a code and when we have a file. When we have to deal with those, our objects need to be different. I.e., when we have to write something onto the file, we should have an object. Here the object's name is file handler. We can give our own names to the file handlers that are dealing with certain type of files. So here the object name is file dealer, and that object was of class off stream, output stream, and that object can be used to output something onto the file. Just like cout could be used to write something onto the console, similarly off stream object can be used to output something onto the file. Similarly, an object of type if stream can be used to bring data into the code, just like cin can be used to bring data into the code from console. If stream object can be used to bring data into the code from file. So here for example, if we had an if stream object, we can define it ourselves. It is named file handle, for example. You can give it any name, file agent, any name. So third thing, when we want to write something onto the file as well as read something from the file through the same object, it should be of type fstream, and that is what we define our object file handler to be of class fstream. So fstream's object here in this case the name is file handler, can be used for writing something onto the file as well as reading something from the file into our code. So this was basically the general overview of the concept of file handling. Now last time we saw that when we want to use fstream objects, we have to include a header file fstream that basically contains the classes like offstream, fstream, ifstream in itself, and so their objects can be used. Then we define an object file handler. That was an object that can basically take the data to the file and can read the data from the file. This object can use certain functions like open and close present in the class fstream that was present in the header file fstream by using the object itself. File handler dot open, we used to do basically three things. We used to open the file, we used to write something onto the file, and then we close the file. The first thing is opening the file, and what file do we need to open? The file's name is test file. Its data type is txt, and we are opening it in output mode because when we are writing something onto the console, we make use of cout. Similarly, when we have to write something onto the file, we have to make use of file. We have to open the file in output mode. So here we are opening the file in output mode, and the file's name is test file. Its data type is txt, and then we are writing something onto the file in second step. The writing is exactly in the same manner as we would use cout. If we had used cout to write onto the console, for example, hello, we were writing onto the console. Rest of it remains the same. However, here the object cout can be used because it is of ostream data type, and ostream objects can be used to write onto the console. However, here we cannot use cout. Here we need to make use of an object that is of type offstream or of type fstream, because offstream objects can be used to write something onto the file and fstream objects can be used for both purposes, i.e. writing onto the file as well as reading from the file. So a file handler object was used in place of cout to write something onto the file, and rest of it remains the same. We have an insertion operator, and that insertion operator is basically followed by whatever we are wanting to write onto the screen present in the inverted commas ended with the semicolon. Similarly, when we are done writing something onto the file, we just need to close that file. And in this case, if this file with this name and this data type is not already present in the project folder or the path we have given here, it basically creates that file first in the project folder or at that path if it is not already present here. So that is what we did last time, how we can write something onto the file. Now we have a test file.txt file in the project folder that is basically containing the data hello world, and that is how we can write something onto the file. Now we want to read that data from the file what we have written onto the file, and that code will basically be written here. Now let us see how we can read that thing that is written in the file. Now we have something that is written in this file. Now we are reading what is written in this file and displaying that onto the console. So this basically when we have a file, it is basically a stream of data, and that can be read as a string of characters. For example, hello world is basically a string of certain characters, HELLO space WORLD. These are basically certain characters, and this when we are reading something from the file, it can be read as a string of characters. So just like we just saw an example how we can take a string input from the console, we can take a string input from the file as well. However, there will be certain changes like we cannot use scene directly. We have to use an object that can take input from the file into our code. So that is why we studied string input just now. So we first define a variable named string. Just like we would have defined it if we were taking data from input from console, string input from console. We defined a variable receiver that will hold the value that will come from the file. Just like when we are inputting something from the console, we already have a variable in our code that is reserved for storing that value, so that value can have certain place to go in the memory. Here we have a string variable named receiver, and that variable is basically will hold the value that will come from the file here. The first step is the same. We have to open the file. Second step is we have to take input, and third step is we have to close the file. This thing here is written for the better understanding. When you write something here, you can know what is stored in the variable receiver here. So this is just for understanding. Broadly, the concepts are just three. However, there will be a 3a and a 3b here for further understanding, but let's understand these three broad concepts first. Just like we had three concepts here, opening the file, writing something, and closing the file. Similarly, here we are opening the file. Now here the condition is that that file should already be present. Because we are reading something from the file, so that file needs to be present in the project folder with the name test file with the data type txt. And here we are opening it in input mode. Here we used to open it in output mode because we were outputting some data onto the file. However, here we are taking some input from the file. The file needs to be opened in input mode when we are reading data from file. First step is opening the file in input mode. However, here the file should already be present. Here if it was not present, it will create it, no issues. However, here it should be already be present, and then it will be opened in input mode. Now when we are taking input from the console, what we used to do was we basically used to write getLine cin, for example receive is our variable, and that was basically what we used to do when we were receiving input from the console. However, here we are receiving input from the file. So we cannot use cin. Just like we could not use cout here with the file handler, we cannot use cin here. We have to introduce an object that is capable of reading from the file. So and that object is basically file handler. File handler is the kind of object that can take the data to the file as well as can bring the data from the file. So cin will be replaced by an object file handler. Just like file handler here was replacing cout, here file handler is replacing cin. And that input that will basically now be coming from the file testfile.txt will be stored in receiver. Just like here, whatever user used to give input from the console used to come in the variable receive. Here, for example, here the value is coming from the file through the object file handler that is capable of bringing data from the file onto the console and storing it into a string variable named receiver that we could use because of inclusion of the header file #include string or #include string.h. So now we have received something from the file. Now when we have get line, we know that we receive until we arrive at a new line character. Basically the third argument here is a \n, that is a new line character, and if we do not write the third argument, it by default means it is a new line character. So when we are reading something from the console, the third argument of this getLine function or the delimiter is basically new line character, and if there is a comma or a asterisk or a space or whatever here in place of new line character, that is basically treated as a delimiter. That tells up to which point we will be reading our data. Delimiter. By default the delimiter is \n, however it can be a comma or space, anything. So here when we have not put the third argument in, it means that and we are dealing with the files, it means that the third argument is \n, and if the third argument \n is not arrived, it basically reads up to the end of file. GetLine, when used with files, when the file stream objects are used for bringing in the data through the getLine function, reads either until the delimiter arrives or until the end of file arrives. In this case, there was no end of file found, so here it does not, there is no end of file when we are taking input from the console. However, in files we have an end of file. For example, if we have written hello world, it means that there is another thing after hello world, that is basically the end of file. That thing EOF, it is known, end of file, it is known. So this function reads until the delimiter arrives, and here the delimiter was \n, or until the end of file arrives. Because if it does not read until the end of file, there is no \n in this code. We have not written any single \n in this code. Here, when the user presses enter after inputting some data from the console, \n is by default comes. However, if this provision is not provided here, it will never arrive at \n in this case. So it reads either to the point where delimiter occurs, or it reads to the point where end of file occurs. So here the delimiter by default was \n, and \n never arrived, so we will be taking input from the file into the variable receiver until the end of file arrives, because there was no \n. So end of file arrives here, so this line gets executed, and now whatever was read from the file is stored in the variable receiver, and when we output a receiver onto the console, what is outputted on the screen? Hello space world. This is basically what would be outputted onto the console window. Cout console. Now we are writing onto the console, we can use cout normal object. So we have received data from the file into our code, and from our code we have sent it onto the console. This line was just written in order to understand what is received in the receiver. And third step is, of course, we have read something from the file into our code and we are writing that onto the console. So third step is basically closing that file. Just like there were three steps here, one or two concepts remain here. Three that will be named 3a and 3b, but that is how we can input something from the file, and we have displayed it onto the console for better understanding. Three broader concepts: opening the file in input mode, receiving the input from the file through the object of class fstream into the variable string receiver, until the end of file comes or the delimiter comes. Here the delimiter never came, end of file was reached, it goes into the next line, prints whatever was received here from the file through the object file handler present in the class fstream in the header file fstream. So we display it on the screen, and third is, of course, we close the file. That is how, broadly speaking, we read data from the file. However, one or two minor explanations are coming ahead. Usually when we are reading data from the file, we introduce another line of code in our programs that basically checks for whether the file we are trying to open has been opened or not. Just like we used to make use of functions open and close when we were either writing onto the file or when we were reading something from the file, we used to make use of functions open and close, open for opening the file and close for closing the file. And there is another function named isOpen that basically checks for whether the file we are trying to open is open or not. This function basically returns 1 if the file is open, and it returns 0 if the file is not open. Here when we were writing something onto the file, it did not matter whether the file has been present there or not, because if it were not present, it was automatically created by the computer first. However, here it is a necessity that the file should be present in that place so that it can be read from. So we introduce this line of code so as to check whether the file we are trying to open is open or not. When we have opened the file through this line of code, testfile.txt iOS input, we have opened this file named test file data type text.txt and opened it input mode, and in the immediate next line we are checking whether the file we had opened is open now or not, and if it is open, this particular function returns the value 1. And if it is not open, it returns the value 0, and we arrived at the else situation. Here if these kind of mistakes occur when for example while writing the name in our program, here I wrote instead of test file, tst file. We, for example, by mistake skipped an e here in the file name. Now computer does not know itself, it just knows what we command it, and to it can only think how we command it to think. Here we gave computer the command to open the file with the name of tst file.txt. However, this file was not present there. The file that was present there was test file, so it cannot read any data from that particular file because that file does not exist. So it is usually a good practice to check in this line whether the file we are trying to open is open or not, and if it is open, it returns the value 1, and when there is a 1 or a true in the condition of if statement, it basically executes the code written in between that brackets, and this code is basically reading something from the file into the string variable and then displaying it onto the screen, and then closing the file. This basically executes if the file has been opened, because if the file is opened, correct file has been opened and the correct data is read into the string variable, only then we can print it onto the screen, and then we will be able to do our task. However, if the file, if for example in this case, the test file will not open, and for example tst file is not present in that folder, so it will not open, and this will return value 0, because if open is false, so it will return value 0 or false. So when we have a 0 or a false in if condition, we go to the else situation, and in else we have an error opening the file, or error encountered, or whatever message that is written here will be displayed onto the console, so as to tell that the file you are trying to open is not present, or there is some sort of an error. Then we look at the code again, we place an E here, we know that test file is present there, so now when it will check if the file is open or not, it will return 1, and when if has a 1 in its condition, it executes in the code written in its if brackets. The correct file has been opened, the correct data is read, and it is displayed on the screen, and it is closed. It's just like we would do in a normal operation. These kind of scenarios occur when we might write TES double T, or we may write a small f in place of capital F. Such scenarios are likely there, so it helps us in debugging our program and finding our error if the error is already present. So here we did not need to write this thing because to check whether the file is already there, because if it is already not there, it automatically creates it first. However, here it is important to check whether the file has been opened or not, so that is why we include this line of code. So next we have is that next concept that needs understanding is that what if the thing that we have written in our file is something like this: hello next line word, and that can be written like hello new line character word. So this is basically word is written in front of it, but due to limitation of space it is gone on to the next line. This is basically hello new line character word. This basically how it writes it onto the file, hello in the next line word, and that's it. So what would happen in that particular case? We know that getLine function has 3 arguments, and if it is written 2 arguments, it is by default that the third argument is \n. And when we are dealing with the files, it means that we will read from the file through the file handler object into the string variable until the delimiter occurs, or until the end of file occurs. Just like in the last example, we had written hello world in the same line, and there after that end of file character was encountered, and that end of file character just stopped the reading of that data into the string variable. As just like in the case when we are reading from the console, for example getLine scene receive, we are receiving something into the string variable receive, and the third argument by default here is \n, that is a new line character. As soon as the \n character occurs, or whatever delimiter that is written here is encountered, and this getLine function stops reading from the console through the object cin_word into the variable rec. Similarly here, as soon as the delimiter is encountered or the end of file is reached, this object that can read the data from the file into the string variable receiver will stop reading as soon as the delimiter is encountered or the end of file is reached. Now how it is written, things are written in our file is that there is a hello, then there is an invisible \n here that might not be visible in your text files or in your Word documents, because when you press enter in your Microsoft Word or Microsoft Text, you basically go into the next line. However, it is not clearly written that \n in your Word program. So similarly, there is an invisible character \n here that can basically be shown like this. However, just like in this example, we had an end of file character written at the end of the file. Here we have an end of file character written at the end where the file is basically ending. We know that we will be reading until the delimiter is encountered, and the delimiter is encountered here. and as soon as the delimiter is encountered, this function stops reading something. The function, as soon as backslash n arrives, this stops reading. The receiver only holds the value hello, and we print that hello onto the screen. So the whole thing, hello world, does not get printed onto the screen. However, only hello gets printed onto the screen because we had encountered the delimiter, and as soon as the delimiter is encountered, the getLine function stops reading, and whatever data was received from the file is now displayed onto the screen, and that was only hello. In the previous case, there was no backslash n character. It was just like hello world, and it stopped when the end of file was reached. However, here there was a new line character, it stopped here as soon as the delimiter was encountered, and then we displayed that thing onto the console. That is the second concept. Another concept remains that we'll be discussing in a couple of minutes. Now we have encountered a problem. What we wanted to do, that we wanted to receive all the contents of this particular file and display them onto the console. However, with the previous code that we had written, we were not able to do that because as soon as the delimiter arrived, we basically stopped reading the data from the file, and thus we were not able to retrieve the whole content that was present in the file. So what do we need to do to encounter that problem is basically we need to do the same thing but with the data that is coming afterwards. That is basic. That technically means that we need to employ the loop here. So we employ a while loop here. What this while loop does is that first it reads into the string variable through the fstream object until the delimiter arrives, and as soon as the backslash n arrives, it stops reading. Then it prints that onto the screen. For example, we print hello onto the screen. Now, had there been no loop, it would have print that value and then close that file. However, here we have a loop. What loop does is that it goes back here to evaluate this expression here. So whenever something is being read from the file, this particular expression returns 1 or a true. However, when nothing is read from the file, null is being read, you can say, so it returns a null or a 0 or a false, so while stops. Next, it was reading something from the file. And what was it reading? It was reading something through the fstream object file handler into the string variable receiver until the delimiter arrived or the end of file arrived. And in this case, the delimiter did not arrive. However, we arrived at the end of file. So we read things until the end of file arrives, and now the receiver holds the value world. Now world will be printed onto the console. Now it will go back. Now we have reached the end of file. Now it will not be reading anything. So the getLine function will just be returning null or a 0 or a false. So when we have a false in the brackets of while loop, whatever is written inside these does not get executed. So these brackets are skipped, and we go ahead, and then we have read all the contents of the file and have displayed onto the console, although not necessarily in the same manner. That will need a further bit of tweaking. You should try that on your own. However, we have retrieved all the contents of the file onto the console now by employing the loop here. When everything has been read from the file and the end of file is achieved, it basically closes the file as a third step, and we are done with our tasks. So to summarize everything, what we did is that we studied how we can read data from the files, then we started reading the data, then we saw there are 3 steps, basically opening the file, taking input from the file into our code, and then closing the file. Just like there were 3 steps: opening, writing, and closing. opening, reading, taking input and closing. Then we said that we need to employ a statement to check whether the file is open or not, and at the very end we introduced a last concept that we need to employ things in the loop, because we were not able to completely read all the contents of our file. So we found a way by employing a loop that basically reads all the data from the file onto the console. In order to read the data from the file onto the console, exactly in the same manner, it will need a bit of tweaking, and you should try that on your own. So that's what pretty much it from today. We studied how we can take input from the file into our program.